They say true love is a soul's recognition of its counterpoint in another. But what happens when that soul is cursed? What happens when the man you love is destined to become a monster? This story isn't about how a man falls to a beast. It's about how his wife refuses to let him go. It's a story that starts with a hidden, bloody secret 30 years in the past and ends with a choice. A choice between a rifle aimed at a heart you love and a silver locket held out as the only hope against the coming darkness. Chapter 1. The Face of the Wolf. The air in the Oregon mountains of 1995 had a bite that sunk deeper than the cold. It was a wet, ancient chill that clung to the dripping furs and seeped through the layers of a boy's flannel jacket. For 10-year-old Arthur, the forest was not a place of wonder. It was a cathedral of judgment. Every snapped twig under his boots was a mistake. Every shiver a weakness noted by the silent, stone-faced man walking ahead of him. His father, Uther. "Keep up," Uther grunted, not bothering to look back. His voice was like the crack of a rifle, sharp and final. He moved through the tangled undergrowth with the brutality of economy of motion, a predator in his own right, his .30-06 rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. Arthur scrambled to obey, his smaller legs burning. They had been tracking a buck for hours, or at least Uther had. Arthur was just tracking his father, trying to match his stride, trying to earn a single glance that wasn't filled with disappointment. The hunt was meant to be a rite of passage, the day Uther finally saw a man in his son. But Arthur felt smaller than ever, a ghost haunting the edges of his father's world. The damp smell of pine needles and decaying leaves filled his lungs, a scent he would forever associate with fear. Then, the world went silent. Uther stopped so abruptly that Arthur nearly collided with his legs. His body was rigid, a statue carved from granite in tension. He slowly raised his hand, palm flat, a universal command for stillness. Arthur froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He followed his father's gaze, peering through a thicket of ferns into a small, misty clearing. There it was, a magnificent 10-point buck, its head bowed as it grazed on moss. Its antlers were a crown of ivory against the gray gloom. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. It was beautiful, perfect. For a moment, the cold and the fear vanished, replaced by a profound sense of awe. He saw his father slowly, deliberately begin to raise his rifle. The movement was fluid, practiced, deadly. But Arthur's focus was pulled away, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something was wrong. The air, already cold, seemed to drop 10 degrees. The birdsong had died. The squirrels had vanished. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. It was the silence of prey. Something emerged from the deep shadows of the ancient cedars. It was not a bear. It was not a cougar. It stood on 2 legs, but they were bent at an unnatural angle, like a dog's. It was tall, impossibly so, its lanky frame covered in patchy, matted fur the color of grave dirt. Its arms were too long, ending in what looked less like hands and more like clumps of yellowed claws. But the head was the epicenter of the nightmare. It was a grotesque fusion of man and wolf, with a long canine snout filled with splintered teeth. Yet its eyes burned with a feverish, intelligent light, a malevolent, human light. It moved with a limping, lurching gait, its gaze fixed on the oblivious buck. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that vibrated in Arthur's bones, a sound of pure, bottomless hunger. Arthur made a sound, a tiny, involuntary gasp of terror. It was barely audible, but in the crushing silence, it was a thunderclap. The creature's head snapped in their direction. Those intelligent, burning eyes locked onto his.
Arthur felt his soul being flayed open. In that gaze, he saw not just animalistic fury, but a universe of agony, of a mind trapped within a monstrous prison. "Down!" Uther's voice was a serrated whisper. He grabbed the collar of Arthur's jacket and yanked him back, away from the clearing, his own face a mask of ashen terror. The awe and discipline were gone, replaced by a primal fear Arthur had never seen in his father. It terrified him more than the monster itself. Uther practically threw him toward a massive oak tree with a hunting blind nestled high in its branches. "The ladder! Now! Don't make a sound!" Arthur's limbs felt like lead, but the terror propelled him forward. He scrambled up the wooden rungs, his fingers numb, his eyes still seeing that horrible, twisted face. Uther was right behind him, his heavy breaths loud in the stillness. They tumbled onto the small wooden platform, and Uther pulled the trapdoor shut, plunging them into the dim, dusty enclosure. Through a narrow slit in the wood, Arthur watched, mesmerized by horror. The creature limped into the clearing. It ignored them, its entire being focused on its original prey. The buck finally sensed the danger, its head shooting up, nostrils flaring. For a heartbeat, it was frozen in terror, then it bolted. The creature moved with a speed that defied its broken body. It covered the length of the clearing in 3 long, loping strides, a blur of dark fur and murderous intent. It launched itself into the air, a nightmare silhouette against the gray sky, and crashed down upon the deer with a sickening crunch of bone and tearing flesh. Arthur clamped his hands over his ears, but he could not block out the sound, the wet, ripping noises, the guttural snarls of feeding. Uther stood beside him, rifle raised, his knuckles white. He wasn't aiming. He was just holding it, a useless talisman against an ancient god of death.
They stayed in that blind for hours, long after the sounds had stopped, long after the creature had dragged the mangled carcass back into the deep woods. They waited until the bruised purple of twilight bled into the ink black of night. Only then did Uther finally move. "We are never speaking of this," he said, his voice hollow. "Not to your mother, not to anyone, ever. Do you understand me, Arthur?" Arthur, trembling in the dark, could only nod. He understood. He understood that the world was not what he thought it was. He understood that there were things in the woods that defied reason, things that had the eyes of a man and the face of a wolf. And he understood that his father, the man he thought was invincible, was just as terrified as he was. The rite of passage was complete, but it had not made him a man. It had made him a keeper of a terrible, suffocating secret. Chapter 2. City Lights. Fading Love. 30 years later, the only hunting Arthur did was for the right word. The dense, threatening forests of Oregon had been replaced by the concrete canyons of San Francisco. His world was a 4th-floor apartment with a view of the Bay Bridge, a world of deadlines, lukewarm coffee, and the gentle, ever-present hum of a city that never slept. He was a writer, crafting fictional worlds to escape the memory of one horrifyingly real one. The front door clicked open, and Kalan blew in like a contained hurricane, her trench coat swirling around her. She dropped her oversized leather bag by the door, kicked off her heels, and ran a hand through her chestnut hair, dislodging a pencil Arthur hadn't realized was there. "Hey," she said, her voice tired, but still carrying the sharp, inquisitive edge of a journalist who had just spent 10 hours chasing a lead. The source for the zoning fraud piece finally called back. "Total slimeball, but he's terrified. I think we've got him." Arthur looked up from his laptop, forcing a smile. "That's great, Ka. Really." He wanted it to be great. He wanted to feel the spark of pride, to ask her a dozen questions about the story. But a familiar, dull ache settled in his chest. He glanced at the clock on his screen. 8:17 p.m. "Denny was asking for you," he said, his tone flatter than he intended. "Her school had the Starlight Reading Night. She read a poem she wrote about a snail who wants to be an astronaut." Kalan's face fell. The victory from her professional coup evaporated, replaced by a wash of guilt. "Oh God,
That was tonight. I completely forgot. I wrote it down, I swear." She walked over to him, her shoulders slumping. "How was she?" "She was amazing," Arthur said, the pride in his voice genuine now. "She had this little squeak when she got to the part about the snail building a rocket out of lettuce. The whole room melted." He paused. "She looked for you in the crowd." The words hung in the air, heavier than he meant them to be. It was the old argument, the one they never had out loud anymore. It played out in missed dinners, in late-night apologies, in the growing space between them in their king-sized bed.
Her career was taking off, a soaring rocket built of ambition and talent, while he worked from home, the stable, predictable anchor. He was proud of her, fiercely so, but he was also lonely, and he saw that loneliness reflected in his daughter's eyes. "Arthur, I'm sorry," Kaylin said, her voice soft. She knelt beside his chair, her hand resting on his knee. Her touch was electric, as it always was, a reminder of the fire that still smoldered beneath the ash of routine and resentment. He soared and raged and cried, but he didn't let. "This story is it's huge. It could be a career maker." "Everything as a career maker, Kaylin," he said, the bitterness leaking out despite his best efforts. He hated the sound of his own voice, the petty, whining tone. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the exhaustion shadowing her beautiful, intelligent eyes, the way she chewed on her lower lip when she was stressed. He still loved her so much it felt like a physical weight in his chest. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Isn't it?" he countered, his voice rising slightly. "What about us? What about Denny? She's 7. She's not going to be 7 forever. These moments, the astronaut snail poems, they don't come back." A familiar primal anger began to coil in his gut. It was a dark, hot thing he had carried since childhood. It was Uther's anger, a legacy of silent disapproval and rigid control. He felt it when a driver cut him off, when a line at the grocery store was too long, and most intensely when he felt his family was being threatened or neglected. He clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles straining. He had to get a grip. "I know," Kaylin said, her own eyes welling up. "You think I don't know that? You think I like choosing between my daughter and a deadline? I'm doing this for us, for our future." "Our future is happening right now," he snapped. A small voice cut through the tension. "Mommy!" They both turned. Denny stood in the hallway, a small 7-year-old silhouette in unicorn pajamas, clutching a stuffed wolf. Her eyes were wide, taking in the scene with the unnerving clarity of a child. Kaylin's face crumpled. "Hey, Sweet Pea. I'm sorry I missed your poem. Daddy told me it was the best one." Denny padded into the room and climbed into Arthur's lap, burying her face in his chest. "It's okay," she mumbled. "Daddy filmed it." Arthur wrapped his arms around her, the anger inside him dissolving instantly, replaced by a wave of fierce, protective love. He inhaled the scent of her lavender-scented shampoo. She was his whole world. He looked at Kaylin over Denny's head, his expression softening. The fight was stupid. They were on the same team. Later, after Denny was tucked back into bed, Kaylin came to him as he stood by the large window overlooking the city lights. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head against his back. "I hate fighting with you," she murmured into his shirt. "Me too," he said, placing his hands over hers. "I'm sorry. He trailed off. He didn't know how to explain the rage, the fear of loss that was so tightly wound around his heart. "I know," she said. "You're her protector. You're my protector." She squeezed him tighter. "I love you for that. But sometimes you have to trust that I can protect us too, in my own way." He turned in her arms, facing her. The city lights reflected in her eyes. "I do trust you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just miss you." "I miss you too," she whispered. She rose on her toes and kissed him, a long, slow kiss that was both an apology and a promise. It was a reminder that under the layers of stress and misunderstanding, the foundation of their love was still there. But Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that it was a foundation sitting on a fault line, and the ground was beginning to tremble. Chapter 3. A Key to a Locked Past. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a credit card offer and a home furnishings catalog. It was a plain manila envelope, deceptively mundane.
There was no return address, just a postmark from a small, forgotten town in rural Oregon. Arthur stared at it, a cold dread trickling down his spine. He hadn't received mail from that part of the world in 15 years. Not since the last stilted phone call with his father, an argument about nothing that had become an argument about everything, ending in a silence that had stretched into a permanent estrangement. He carried the envelope into the kitchen, his fingers feeling strangely numb. Colin was at the counter, scrolling through emails on her tablet, a half-eaten piece of toast beside her. "Anything good?" she asked without looking up. "I don't know," he said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. She glanced up, catching his tone and the look on his face. Her journalistic instincts kicked in, her eyes sharpening. "What is it?" He tore the envelope open. Inside were 2 items. The first was a single rust-pitted key, heavy and old-fashioned, attached to a faded leather tag. The second was a folded document, an official certificate from the state of Oregon. He unfolded it. The sterile bureaucratic font seemed to mock the gravity of the words. Certificate of Presumptive Death. Name of decedent, Uther Lowell. Date of disappearance, approximately 12 months prior. Location last seen, Coos County, unincorporated forest land. Finding, declared legally deceased after failure to locate. He read the words, but they didn't compute. Uther was gone. Not dead in a hospital bed, not lost to a sickness he could understand, but simply vanished, swallowed by the same woods that had haunted Arthur's nightmares for 30 decades. The report mentioned his truck had been found abandoned on an old logging road, keys in the ignition, a half-empty thermos of coffee on the passenger seat. He had walked into the forest and never walked out. A bitter, hysterical laugh escaped Arthur's lips. "Well, the bastard finally did it," he breathed. "Did what? Arthur, what is that?" Kaylin was by his side now, her hand on his arm, her eyes scanning the document. Her face softened from curiosity to concern. "Oh, Arthur, my God." He didn't feel grief in the way he was supposed to. He felt a hollow, echoing emptiness, the final slamming door on a relationship that had been a series of locked rooms.
There would be no reconciliation, no final confrontation, no chance to ask the questions that had festered inside him for 30 years. What did we see that day? Why did we never talk about it? Why couldn't you just be a father? "He's gone," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash. He tossed the certificate onto the counter and held up the key, and he left me the goddamn house. Callan picked up the certificate, her expression a mixture of sympathy and professional analysis. "Presumptive death? They couldn't find him at all?" "He probably got eaten by a bear," Arthur said with a shrug, the callousness of the remark surprising even himself. "Or maybe he just walked until his heart gave out. A fitting end for a man who is more comfortable with trees than with his own son." "Don't say that," she said softly, rubbing his back. "He was still your father." "Was he?" The anger, that familiar hot coil, tightened in his stomach. "He was a drill sergeant, a ghost. He taught me how to shoot a rifle and how to keep my mouth shut. That's the entire inheritance he gave me, until now." He gestured wildly at the key. He spent the rest of the day in a fog, canceling his deadlines, answering Denise's questions with monosyllabic replies. The key sat on his desk, a small metal accusation. He was the next of kin. He was responsible. There were belongings to sort, a property to sell, a life to dismantle, a life he knew almost nothing about. That evening, Callan found him staring out the window again, the key clutched in his hand. "We have to go," he said, not looking at her. "I have to pack it up, sell it. I don't want any part of it." "I know," she said, coming to stand beside him. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker to life. "Maybe," she began, her voice tentative, "maybe this is a good thing." He turned to her, her brow furrowed. "A good thing? My estranged father is declared dead after vanishing in the woods. How is any part of that a good thing?" "Not that part," she said quickly. "The trip, getting out of the city. All of us. You, me, Denise. No deadlines, no emails. Just us." She took his hand,
her fingers lacing with his. "You said you miss me. I miss you. We've been drifting, Arthur. Maybe this is what we need. A week away to be together, to fix things. We can pack up the house, get your closure, and we can find our way back to each other." He looked at her, at the earnest hope in her eyes. The idea of returning to that place, to the woods that held such visceral terror for him, made his stomach churn. But the idea of saving his marriage? That was a powerful lure. The thought of spending a week with just Callan and Denis, away from the pressures that were grinding them down, felt like a lifeline. Could he face the ghosts of his past to secure his family's future? He looked at the key in his palm. It was no longer just a burden. Now, imbued with Callan's hope, it looked a little like an opportunity. "Okay," he said very softly. "Okay, let's go." Chapter 4. The Road to Nowhere. The transition was gradual, then sudden. The polished glass and steel of San Francisco gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to rolling golden hills dotted with oak trees. The further north they drove on Highway 101, the more the landscape changed. The hills grew steeper, the oaks were replaced by towering redwoods, and the air itself seemed to shift, growing cooler, thicker, pregnant with the smell of damp earth and salt from the nearby coast. Denis was a ball of energy in the back seat, her face pressed against the window. "Are we in the giant forest yet, Daddy? Is it bigger than Golden Gate Park?" "Much bigger, Sweet Pea," Arthur said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her innocence was a balm on his frayed nerves. "This forest goes on for hundreds of miles." "Wow," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. Beside him, Colin had her laptop balanced on her knees, trying to get one last article filed before she exhausts cell service completely. Every few minutes she would look up, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "Almost done, I promise." Arthur just nodded, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The familiarity of their dynamic, even here, grated on him. He was driving them toward his past, and she was still tethered to the life he desperately wanted to escape, if only for a week. He felt a pang of nostalgia, so sharp it was almost painful, for a different kind of road trip. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He was 22, she was 21. They were in his beat-up Honda Civic, driving to Big Sur for the weekend. The windows were down, the wind was whipping through Kaylin's hair, and some loud, forgettable indie rock band was blasting from the speakers. She was laughing, a pure, uninhibited sound, as she tried to read a map that was flapping wildly in the wind. "I think we were supposed to turn back there," she shouted over the music. "A detour, not a mistake," he'd yelled back, grinning. "The best adventures start with a wrong turn." Later, they had parked at an overlook, the Pacific Ocean stretching out before them like a sheet of hammered blue steel. He had turned to her, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "I love you," he'd said, the words feeling inadequate for the sheer magnitude of his feelings. She hadn't said it back. Instead, she had leaned across the console, her eyes sparkling with mischief and a fierce intelligence that captivated him, and kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and sunshine and the reckless, beautiful certainty of their future. "Arthur?" Colin's voice snapped him back to the present. He blinked, the phantom taste of salt dissipating from his tongue. "You okay?" she asked, her laptop now closed and stowed in her bag. "You were a million miles away." "Just thinking," he said, his voice gruff. She reached over and placed her hand on his thigh, her thumb stroking the worn denim of his jeans. "Good thoughts, I hope." "The best," he admitted, his voice softening. He glanced at her, and the years seemed to fall away. She was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The lines around her eyes were from late nights and laughter, the slight silver strands at her temples a testament to the life they had built. He loved this version of her just as much, if not more. So why did it feel so hard? "Me too," she said, as if reading his mind. "I'm glad we're doing this." As they turned off the main highway and onto the winding state roads, the sky began to cloud over. The towering trees crowded the narrow asphalt, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a green, gloomy tunnel. Cell service vanished. The world contracted to the space inside their truck. Denis had fallen asleep in the back, her head lolling to one side. The quiet was thick, broken only by the hum of the tires on the pavement. "It's dance," Kalan murmured, looking out at the wall of green. "It's the reason people get lost out here," Arthur said, his own unease growing with every mile that took them deeper into the woods. The memories were getting stronger, less like faded photographs and more like fresh wounds. The feeling of damp moss under his hands as he climbed the ladder, the smell of gun oil and his father's cold sweat, the sound of tearing flesh. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the images. "Did you come out here a lot as a kid?" Kalan asked, sensing his disquiet. "Every fall," he said. Arthur called it harvesting, not hunting, like the deer were just crops to be reaped. He was practical about it, about everything. "That must have been hard." "It was what it was," he said. The old habit of shutting down, of keeping his mouth shut, taking over. It was Arthur's primary lesson. The sun began to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. The GPS on his phone had long since died, and now he was navigating by memory, searching for a half-forgotten logging road that was supposed to be his turnoff. The trees looked the same, a relentless, repeating pattern of bark and shadow. A sense of disorientation began to set in. He was sure this was the right way, but nothing looked familiar. The woods of his memory were menacing, but they were knowable. This forest was just alien. "I think we might be lost," he finally admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "It's okay," Kalan said calmly, though she could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "We'll find it. Maybe we should pull over and wait for morning." Before he could answer, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom behind them, growing steadily brighter. A beat-up old Ford pickup truck pulled up alongside them, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a man in his late 30s, with a kind, weathered face and a friendly smile. "You folks look a little turned around," he said, his voice a warm local drawl. Arthur rolled down his window. "You could say that. We're looking for the old Lowell place." The man's smile widened in recognition. "Arthur! Arthur Lowell! My God, is that you?" He peered closer. "It's me, Leon Keel." Recognition dawned on Arthur. Leon, the son of his father's only friend, a boy he'd run through these same woods with during the few times their fathers had allowed them to play instead of work. "Leon! Wow, it's been, 20 years? Closer to 25, my friend. Heard about your dad. I'm real sorry. Look, you're on the right track, but you missed the turnoff about a mile back. It's not marked anymore. Follow me, I'll lead you in." A wave of relief washed over Arthur. "Thanks, Leon. We'd appreciate that."
As Leon's truck pulled ahead, its red taillights a welcome beacon in the deepening twilight, Colin squeezed his leg. "See? A friendly face. Everything's going to be fine." Arthur wanted to believe her. He really did. But as he followed the taillights into the oppressive darkness of the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not on the road to nowhere. They were on a road leading straight into the heart of a 30-year-old nightmare. Chapter 5. First Blood. The track Leon led them down was less a road and more a suggestion of one. It was a pair of deep ruts carved into the earth, overgrown with weeds and slick with damp leaves. The truck's suspension groaned in protest as they bounced and jostled their way deeper into the woods. The interlocking branches overhead were so thick now that the last vestiges of twilight were completely extinguished. They were in a world of roaring engine and the narrow tunnel carved out by their headlights. "Daddy, my tummy feels funny," Denis mumbled from the back, woken by the rough ride. "Just a few more minutes, sweet pea. We're almost there," Arthur said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The forest felt like it was pressing in on them, alive and watchful. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen things. He was 10 years old again, cowering in the dark. Up ahead, Leon's truck slowed. He was pointing out his window, and Arthur could just make out a dilapidated gatepost, the entrance to his father's property. They were here. And then it happened. Something vast and dark darted across the road, caught for a split second in the high beams. It was impossibly fast, a blur of motion and raw power. Arthur's mind screamed bear, but his heart knew better. He saw bent canine legs. He saw arms that were too long. He saw the glint of malevolent eyes. His body reacted before his mind could process. He slammed on the brakes and wrenched the wheel to the right. The tires lost their grip on the slick ground. The world became a horrifying cacophony of screeching metal, shattering glass, and Colin's scream. The truck slid off the road, tilting at a sickening angle as it plowed into the soft, rain-soaked earth of the ditch, coming to a violent stop against the trunk of a massive cedar. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and Denise' terrified whimpers from the back seat. "Everyone okay?" Arthur gasped, his chest aching from the seatbelt. "I think so," she said, her voice trembling. "Denise? Honey? Are you okay?" "I'm scared," came the small, shaky reply. Arthur's door was jammed against the side of the ditch, but Colin's side was clear. "Get Denise. Get out of the truck. Now!" His voice was low, urgent, laced with a terror he hadn't felt in 30 years. He knew what was out there. Up on the road, Leon had stopped his truck and was getting out, his face a mask of concern. "Arthur, you all right?" he yelled, jogging towards them. "Leon, no! Get back in your truck!" Arthur roared, fumbling to unbuckle his seatbelt. But it was too late. The creature emerged from the trees beside the road. It didn't rush. It limped, its movements jerky and unnatural, but it covered the ground with a terrifying purpose. In the red glow of Leon's taillights, they could see it clearly.
The matted, filthy fur, the impossibly long limbs, the wolf-like head on a man's torso. It was the monster from his childhood. Older, more scarred, but undeniably the same. Leon froze, his friendly face contorting in disbelief and horror. He stumbled backward, his hands held up as if to ward off the impossible. "What in God's name?" The creature let out a low, guttural snarl and lunged. It was over in seconds. There was a scream, choked off almost instantly, and the sickening sound of a predator making its kill. Colin, who had just managed to get Denny out of her car seat, saw it happen. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She shielded Denny's eyes, pulling her daughter tight against her chest. Arthur finally got his seatbelt off and scrambled over the center console, pushing Colin and Denny toward the open passenger door. "The house! We have to get to the house! Run!" The creature, finished with Leon, turned its attention to the crashed truck. Its glowing eyes fixed on them, and it started to move in their direction. Terror gave them speed. Arthur practically threw Colin and Denny out of the truck and scrambled out after them. They crashed through the underbrush, thorns and branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Arthur half dragged, half carried Denny, his heart hammering with a single desperate thought: get them inside. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The creature was coming. It wasn't running, it was loping, closing the distance with an effortless, terrifying gait. The house was a dark silhouette against the bruised sky, maybe 100 yards away. It felt like 100 miles. Arthur's lungs burned. Denny was crying, a high, panicked sound. The beast was gaining. He could hear its heavy, ragged breathing. He could smell it, a foul, coppery scent of old blood and wet fur. They reached the porch, a collection of rotting wood and broken steps. Arthur fumbled in his pocket, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, searching for the old key. He found it, jammed it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. Come on," he hissed, jiggling the key frantically. The creature was at the edge of the yard. It paused, its head tilted, watching them with that terrible, intelligent gaze. With a final desperate twist, the lock groaned and gave way. Arthur shoved the door open, pushed Colin and Denny inside, and slammed it shut just as the creature launched itself forward. A heavy, solid thud shook the entire house as the beast hit the door, followed by a furious, frustrated roar that seemed to shake the very foundations. Arthur fumbled for the deadbolt and shot it home. He leaned his back against the solid oak, his body trembling uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. They were inside. They were safe. For now. It was only then, in the dusty, absolute darkness of his father's abandoned house, that he felt the searing, white-hot pain in his left forearm. He looked down. 3 deep parallel gashes ran from his wrist to his elbow, welling with dark, crimson blood. He didn't remember it happening. In the frantic scramble out of the truck, the creature's claws must have caught him. First blood had been drawn, and it was his. Chapter 6. A barricade against the night. The darkness inside the house was total and disorienting. It was thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else. A faint, musky animal scent that made the hairs on Arthur's arms stand up. Outside, the creature let out another frustrated roar, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the thick oak of the door. "Arthur, your arm!" Kaylin's voice was a choked whisper. She fumbled for her phone, the sudden glare of its flashlight blinding them for a second. The beam found his arm, illuminating the blood that was now dripping onto the dusty floorboards. "It's nothing," he lied, his voice strained. "We need to block this door, now." Panic was a physical thing, a cold liquid flooding his veins, but the sight of Kaylin's terrified face and Denny's silent tears shocked him into action. Uther's voice echoed in his head from a lifetime ago. In a crisis, you don't think, you act. He grunted, the memory surfacing. The generator, in the cellar, should be lights. He pointed toward a door under the main staircase. "Take Denny. Lock the door behind you. Find it. There should be a pull start." Kaylin hesitated, her eyes fixed on his bleeding arm. "I'm not leaving you." "There's no time to argue," he roared, the unfamiliar volume of his own voice startling them both. "Go, now." She flinched, but then nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. She grabbed Denny's hand. "Come on, sweetie, let's go find the lights." She disappeared through the cellar door, the heavy bolt sliding shut behind them. Arthur was alone in the main room, with only the relentless scratching at the door for company. He staggered through the darkness, his hands outstretched, bumping into furniture shrouded in white sheets like slumbering ghosts. He found what he was looking for. A heavy oak bookshelf, Uther's pride and joy, filled with leather-bound volumes on engineering and history. Adrenaline surged through him, momentarily numbing the pain in his arm. He put his shoulder to the bookshelf and pushed. It didn't budge. He grunted, his muscles straining, the gash in his arm screaming in protest. With a final desperate heave, the bookshelf groaned and began to slide across the floor, its legs carving deep gouges in the wood. He managed to move it a few feet, enough to wedge it against the front door. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He stumbled around the rest of the ground floor, his uninjured arm sweeping out, finding windows. The scratching at the front door stopped. It was replaced by a more terrifying sound, a slow, deliberate thumping, as if the creature were circling the house, testing the walls, searching for a weak point. He found the latches on the old single-pane windows and fastened them, his heart pounding in time with the thumps outside. Suddenly, a single bare bulb flickered to life overhead, casting a weak yellow glow over the room. A second later, the low rumble of the generator started up from the cellar. Kaylin.
The light revealed the full extent of the room's decay. Dust motes danced in the air, cobwebs draped from the ceiling like funeral shrouds, and a thin layer of grime covered everything. Kaylin emerged from the cellar, her face pale but determined. Danae was right behind her, her tiny fists clutching the back of her mother's jeans. "I found a first aid kit in the laundry room. Sit down, let me see that arm." Arthur sank into a dusty armchair, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving him feeling weak and nauseous. The pain in his arm was now a deep, throbbing ache. Kaylin knelt before him, gently taking his arm. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic from the kit. It stung like hell, but Arthur barely flinched, his mind elsewhere. "Deep," she murmured, her hands surprisingly steady as she worked. Whatever did this, its claws were filthy. She wrapped the arm tightly with gauze, her movements efficient and practiced. As she worked, the first signs began. Arthur's hearing, already sharp, kicked into overdrive. He could hear the generator chugging in the cellar, the buzzing of the light bulb overhead,
the frantic beat of Kaelin's heart, the soft, shallow breaths of his daughter. And outside, he could hear the whisper of the wind through the pines, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, and the soft, almost silent padding of the creature's feet as it circled the house. The sounds were overwhelming, a cacophony that made his teeth ache. A wave of nausea washed over him, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Arthur?" Kaelin asked, finishing the bandage. "You're as white as a sheet. Are you feeling okay?" "Just a lot of blood," he mumbled, trying to hide the truth. It wasn't just the blood loss. Something else was happening. The wound on his arm wasn't just throbbing. It felt hot, alive, as if something had been injected into his veins and was now beginning to spread through his entire body. He looked at the makeshift barricade, at the flimsy-looking windows, and then at his wife and daughter huddled in the dim light. They weren't safe. He had brought them here, to this place of nightmares, and now the nightmare was real, and it was scratching at the door, wanting to get in. And worse, a new cold terror was beginning to dawn, that the real danger wasn't just outside the house. It was inside him, flowing through his blood, and he had no idea what it was going to do. Chapter 7. Whispers in the walls. The night stretched on, an eternity measured in heartbeats. Danae had cried herself to sleep on a dusty sofa, wrapped in Kaelin's coat. Kaelin herself sat in a chair opposite Arthur, her knees drawn up to her chest, her gaze constantly flitting between him and the barricaded door. She held a heavy iron fireplace poker in her lap, her knuckles white. The silence in the house was a taut wire, ready to snap. Outside, the creature had changed its tactics. The overt attacks had ceased, replaced by a campaign of psychological terror. A scrape of claws on a window pane here, a low growl on the porch there. It was toying with them. It knew they were trapped.
For Arthur, the torment was twofold. Every sound from outside was magnified 100 times, a direct assault on his senses. His head pounded with the sensory overload. The smell of the house, dust, decay, and the faint coppery scent of old fear was so strong he could taste it. But it was the other sensation that truly terrified him. With every howl that echoed through the forest, he felt a strange, resonant vibration deep in his chest. It wasn't just a sound he heard, it was a call he felt. A part of him, some ancient, dormant instinct, wanted to howl back. The urge was so strong it made his throat ache. He felt a kinship with the beast outside, a horrifying pull toward the very thing that was trying to kill them. "It's still out there," Kaelin whispered, stating the obvious. "It's not going anywhere," Arthur replied, his voice raspy. He needed a distraction, something to focus on besides the war being waged on his senses and the treasonous call in his blood. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the bookshelf he had moved. The books. His father's books. He stood up, his movements stiff. "Stay here." He walked over to Uther's study, a small wood-paneled room off the main hall. It was exactly as he remembered it, obsessively neat, sterile, and impersonal. A large oak desk stood against one wall, its surface bare except for a single leather-bound journal. Arthur's breath hitched. He had seen his father writing in those journals every night for years, filling them with his precise, angular script. He had always assumed they were engineering logs or work notes. Now, a desperate, illogical hope surged through him. What if they were something more? He picked up the journal. It was old, the leather cracked and worn. He opened it to a random page. The writing was not the neat script he remembered. It was a frantic, sloping scrawl, the ink bleeding in places as if the pen had been pressed down with immense force. October 12th. The moon is waxing. The hunger is worse this time. The smell of the livestock in the next valley. It drives me mad. Fought the urge. Locked myself in the cellar. The chains held. But for how long? The beast is stronger than the man. The beast is winning. Arthur's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking. It was all there,
Decades of it, a tortured chronicle of a man fighting a monstrous curse. April 3rd. It has been passed down for generations. My grandfather called it the family affliction, a tainted bloodline. He told me the stories, but I didn't believe. Not until that hunting trip. The rogue attacked us. It bit my father. He lasted 3 full moons before he put his own rifle in his mouth. I was bitten too. A scratch. Just a scratch. But it was enough. Arthur sank into the desk chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. A scratch. The words echoed the searing pain in his own arm. This wasn't a random monster. This was a curse. His father hadn't been a monster hunter. He was the monster. The creature that had stalked his childhood, the creature that was circling the house right now, it was his father, Uther. The man hadn't vanished in the woods. The woods had claimed him, and the beast within had finally taken over completely. And it had passed the curse on to him.
He flipped to the last entry, dated almost a year ago, around the time Uther had disappeared. September 28th. The change is longer now. The periods of lucidity are shrinking. I look in the mirror and I see its eyes staring back at me. I can feel it watching through my own eyes. I tried to see Arthur one last time, picked up the phone, but what could I say? Forgive me for the monster I am? Forgive me for the monster you might become? I left the key with Keel, with instructions. If I don't come back, send it to the boy. He needs to know. He needs to be ready. The only anchor is love. It sounds like a weakness, but it is the only strength that holds the beast at bay. My love faded into bitterness years ago. I have no anchor left. God help my son. A wave of vertigo washed over Arthur. The stern, cold man he had hated his entire life was not a man devoid of feeling, but a man locked in a desperate, decades-long war for his own soul. His distance wasn't a lack of love, it was a quarantine. He had been protecting Arthur all along. The howl sounded again, closer this time. But now Arthur understood it. It wasn't the roar of a simple beast. It was a cry of agony, of loneliness, of a man forever lost inside a prison of fur and claws. He closed the journal, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He now knew the truth. He was infected. He was changing. And the monster he was destined to become was his own father. He walked back into the main room, the heavy journal in his hand, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Colin looked up at him, the question in her eyes. He didn't know how to even begin to tell her. Chapter 8. Fevered Devotion. "What did you find?" Colin asked, her voice hushed as he returned to the dim light of the main room. She watched him, her journalist's eyes missing nothing. The pallor of his skin, the slight tremor in his hands, the haunted, hollowed-out look that had replaced the fear in his eyes. He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the fireplace and tossed the journal onto the cold stone hearth. It landed with a soft, final thud. He couldn't let her read it, not yet. He couldn't bear to see the hope in her eyes extinguish and be replaced by the same terror he now felt. Just old work logs. He lied, his voice sounding hollow and unconvincing even to himself. Nothing. He sank back into the armchair, a profound weariness settling deep into his bones. The fever that had been simmering under his skin began to spike, sending waves of heat and cold washing over him. His teeth started to chatter. The wound on his arm burned as if it had been cauterized with a hot poker. "Arthur, you're burning up," Colin said, instantly shifting from sentry to caregiver. She was by his side, her cool palm on his forehead. "You're on fire. It's the infection from the scratch. We need to get you to a hospital."
The bitter irony of her words was a knife in his gut. A hospital couldn't fix this. No doctor could cure a curse. He started to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that turned into a hacking cough. "There's no hospital, Ka," he rasped, his vision starting to blur at the edges. "There's just here."
The night wore on, a fever dream of pain and fear. Arthur drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, the world was a nightmare of heightened senses. The dusty air was thick with 1,000 distinct smells. The low hum of the generator was a roar in his ears, and the pain in his arm was a living thing, clawing its way up toward his heart. In his delirium, he was back in the forest as a child, the creature's burning eyes boring into him. Only now, the eyes were his own. He was both the terrified boy and the ravenous monster. Through it all, Kalan was a constant presence. She found blankets and wrapped them around him when he shivered. She found a pail and filled it with murky water from the hand pump in the kitchen, bathing his face with a damp rag when he burned. She sat with him, holding his hand, whispering soothing words that he could barely comprehend. She was an anchor in a raging sea of fever and fear. In one moment of startling clarity, he woke to find her face inches from his. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and unshed tears, but her expression was one of fierce, unwavering love. She had been watching him sleep, her hand protectively on his chest. "Kalan," he breathed, his voice a raw whisper. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." He looked at her, this brilliant, strong, beautiful woman who had tied her life to his. He thought of the life they had built, the daughter they were raising, the love that had become frayed and worn, but had never, ever broken. And he was going to destroy it all. He was going to become a monster that would hunt them. The realization was a physical agony, worse than the fever, worse than the burning in his arm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a single tear escaping his eye and tracing a hot path down his temple. "Don't," she said, her own tears finally falling. "Don't you dare apologize. We are in this together, you and me, always." The conviction in her voice cut through his despair. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers trembling, and cupped her cheek. Her skin was soft, real. He pulled her gently toward him. The space between them disappeared, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of raw, unfiltered emotion. It tasted of salt from their tears, of fever and fear, and of a love so profound it defied the horror that surrounded them. It was a frantic, feverish attempt to feel human, to feel himself one last time. It was a desperate act of possession and of surrender, a branding of his soul upon hers before the beast could claim it. He poured all his love, all his regret, and all his terror into that single, heartbreaking kiss. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He looked into her eyes and tried to memorize every detail of her face. "I love you," he said, the words clear and solid despite the delirium. "No matter what happens, no matter what I become, you have to remember that. The man loves you, always." Kalan didn't understand his words, not fully, but she heard the finality in them, the terrifying undertone of a goodbye. She clung to his hand, her heart breaking. "Arthur, don't talk like that. You're just sick. You're going to be fine."
He closed his eyes, unable to tell her the truth. He let the fever pull him back under, the memory of her kiss a burning ember in the encroaching darkness. It was the last time, he knew, that he would ever kiss his wife as a man. Chapter 9. the beast in his eyes. Dawn did not bring relief, only a weak, gray light that filtered through the grimy windows, revealing the true hopelessness of their situation. The world outside was wrapped in a thick, silent fog. The creature, Uther, had fallen silent, retreating with the darkness. But the new monster, the one gestating inside Arthur, was beginning to wake. The fever broke sometime before sunrise, but what followed was worse. The burning heat was replaced by an unnatural, restless energy. Arthur couldn't stay still. He paced the confines of the house like a caged animal, his bare feet patting silently on the dusty floorboards. The changes were no longer subtle. Kaelin watched him, her heart lodged in her throat. His movements, once familiar and human, had become more efficient, more predatory. He moved with a crouched, fluid grace that was deeply unsettling. "Arthur? Talk to me," she pleaded, following him as he stalked from room to room. He turned to face her, and she had to stifle a gasp. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. But it was his eyes that terrified her. The warm, familiar brown had been subsumed by a sickly yellow-gold hue, and his pupils had become unnervingly sharp and focused. They glowed with a faint internal luminescence in the dim light. When he looked at her, it was like being assessed by a wolf. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a low, guttural growl escaped. Frustration and fear warred in his glowing eyes. He clutched his throat, trying again, but the words wouldn't come. The part of his brain responsible for human language was being overwritten by something else, something older and more primal. He stumbled back, his hands flying to his mouth. A sharp, stabbing pain lanced through his jaw. He could feel his teeth shifting in their sockets, his canines elongating, pressing painfully against his lips. Panic, stark and absolute, flashed in his eyes. He was losing himself, piece by piece. He backed away from her, a wounded animal seeking a dark corner. He flinched when she reached for him. Her touch, which had been a comfort only hours before, now felt like a brand on his hypersensitive skin. "Let me help you," she whispered, her own voice trembling. He shook his head violently, a snarl twisting his lips, revealing the newly lengthened teeth. He didn't want her to touch him. He was terrified of what he might do. The instincts rising within him were not gentle. They were violent, territorial. They saw her not just as his mate to be protected, but as something to be possessed, to be dominated. The conflict was tearing his mind apart. Denny, who had been hiding in the kitchen, peeked around the doorframe. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Arthur's head snapped toward the sound, his predatory gaze locked onto his daughter. For a terrifying second, Kaelin saw no recognition in his eyes, only the cold assessment of a wolf.
Then a flicker of the man she loved broke through. Agony contorted his features. He let out a choked, inhuman sound, a sob and a snarl combined, and turned, punching the wall with his good hand. The old plaster cracked and crumbled under the blow. He couldn't be near them. He was a danger. He staggered toward the back of the house, away from them, finally collapsing in the small, dark laundry room. He curled into a ball on the cold linoleum floor, his body trembling with the effort of fighting his own transforming biology. Kalan stood frozen in the hallway, her mind struggling to process the impossible. This was not just a simple infection. This was a metamorphosis. The man she had kissed in the feverish darkness of the night was being erased, replaced by the thing currently hiding in her laundry room. The fireplace poker felt flimsy and useless in her hands. She let it clatter to the floor. She couldn't fight this, not with force. She looked at the journal Arthur had brought from the study, still sitting on the hearth. He had lied. It wasn't just work logs. His reaction, his transformation, the answer had to be in there. With a new, desperate resolve, she walked over and picked up the leather-bound book. Her hands shook as she opened the cover. Whatever the truth was, she had to know. She had to find a way to save the man who was currently losing the battle for his own soul on the floor of a cold, dark room. Chapter 10. Love in the Face of Fear.
Kalan took the journal to the kitchen table, the only place with enough morning light to read the frantic, spidery script. Denise sat on the floor nearby, playing quietly with a set of old wooden blocks she'd found in a cupboard, occasionally glancing at her mother with worried eyes. Kaylin's heart pounded as she began to read from the first page. She was a journalist. Her job was to uncover the truth, to stare into the dark corners of the world and report what she found. But nothing could have prepared her for the story that unfolded in Uther's tortured handwriting. She read about the curse, a taint in the Lowell bloodline passed down through generations. She read about the agonizing monthly transformations, the battle to retain one's mind as the body betrayed it. She read about Uther's father, who had succumbed to the beast and taken his own life. And she read the entry that made her blood run cold, the account of a hunting trip 30 years ago, an attack by a rogue werewolf, and the single fateful scratch that had condemned Uther to a lifetime of fighting the monster within. It all clicked into place. Arthur's childhood trauma, his estrangement from his father, his own scratch from the night before. This wasn't a sickness, it was an inheritance. Tears streamed down her face as she read of Uther's lonely hidden war. The man she had known only through Arthur's bitter stories was transformed into a tragic, heroic figure. His coldness was a shield. His distance was a desperate act of protection. He had stayed away to keep his son safe from the monster he was, and the monster he feared Arthur could become. Then she found the passage that made her stop, her breath catching in her throat.
The elders, they whispered of a way to fight it, not a cure. There is no cure, but a way to keep the man from being completely consumed by the beast. They called it the anchor. The transformation is a storm of primal instinct, rage, hunger, fear. The anchor is the one thing that can tether the human soul and keep it from being swept away. For some, it is a duty, a memory, a purpose. But the strongest anchor, the only one that truly holds, is love. A love that is fierce, unconditional, and absolute. It must be a conscious choice, a constant fight to remember that love, even when the beast is roaring for control. My own anchor was my duty to protect my son, but it was a love built on fear. It wasn't strong enough. It is frayed. The beast is pulling it loose. The anchor. Love. Kaylin looked up from the journal, her eyes finding Danae on the floor. She then thought of Arthur, curled up in the other room, fighting a battle she couldn't even imagine. Her fear, a cold, paralyzing weight just moments before, was suddenly burned away by a hot, fierce resolve. The helplessness vanished, replaced by a clarity of purpose. She was not a victim in this story. She was a participant. If Arthur's soul was a ship in a hurricane, then she would be his lighthouse. Her love and Danae's would be the light that guided him back. They would be his anchor. She closed the journal. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't kill the beast without killing the man she loved. So she wouldn't try. She would fight for him, not against him. She walked to the laundry room and slowly pushed the door open. Arthur was huddled in the corner, his back to her. His breathing was ragged, and a low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft but firm, betraying none of the fear she felt. He tensed, his head slowly turning. His face was more wolf than man now. His ears were slightly pointed, his nose and jaw elongated, and fine dark hair was beginning to sprout along his cheekbones and the backs of his hands. The golden eyes that fixed on her were filled with pain, rage, and a sliver of desperate recognition. "It's me," she said, taking a slow step into the room. "It's Kaylin. I know what's happening. I read the journal, and I'm not leaving you." A snarl ripped from his throat, a clear warning. "Stay back."
She ignored it, taking another step. "I love you, Arthur. Do you hear me? The beast doesn't get you. You are my husband. You are Danae's father. That is who you are. You have to hold on to that." She kept talking, her voice a steady, soothing mantra. She spoke of their first date, of their wedding, of the day Danae was born. She reminded him of his daughter's laugh, of the feel of her hand in his, of the way he looked at her when she fell asleep on his chest. She was forging the chains of his anchor, link by link, with every memory she uttered. She was 5 feet away now. He was still snarling, his body coiled like a spring, but the rage in his eyes was being tempered by confusion. The human part of him, buried deep beneath the rising tide of instinct, was listening. Then from the hallway, Danae's voice called out, "Mommy, is Daddy okay?"
Arthur's head snapped toward the sound. A wave of agony crossed his face. He looked from the open door, where his daughter stood, to Kaelin, his anchor, and back. He let out a mournful, soul-shattering howl, a sound of a man being torn in two. Suddenly, the house shook with a deafening crash from the front of the house, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. Uther was done waiting. He was coming in. Chapter 11. A Savage Protector. The crash from the front of the house was a thunderclap that shattered the tense standoff in the laundry room. It was the sound of a siege turning into an invasion. Uther had broken through a window. Instinct, raw and immediate, took over. Kaelin whirled around, scooping Danae into her arms and running for the relative safety of the kitchen. "Stay behind me," she yelled, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, a pathetic weapon against the nightmare that was now inside the house with them. In the laundry room, the sound of the invasion had a different effect on Arthur. The internal war between man and beast was momentarily suspended, replaced by a single, overriding imperative that satisfied both sides. Protect the territory, protect the mate, protect the child. He exploded out of the laundry room, not as a man, but as a predator whose den had been breached. He moved on all fours, his newly powerful limbs carrying him across the floor with terrifying speed. He was a blur of motion that shot past Kaelin and Danae, a low, murderous growl ripping from his transformed throat. Arthur watched in shocked awe. The thing that had just been cowering in the corner, fighting his own inner demons, was now charging headlong toward a greater threat. Arthur burst into the living room just as Uther, in his full, monstrous werewolf form, was crawling through the shattered remains of the large bay window. Uther was bigger, his fur thick and silvered with age, his muscles like knotted ropes beneath the skin. He was an alpha predator, ancient and powerful. He rose to his full, intimidating height, shaking glass from his matted fur, his yellow eyes glowing with feral hunger as he scented the air. He smelled them. He smelled fresh prey. Then he saw Arthur. The two beasts froze, sizing each other up. A tense, primal silence filled the room, thick with impending violence. Uther let out a deep, rumbling growl, a challenge from an established alpha to a younger, encroaching rival. Arthur, though smaller and still caught in the agony of mid-transformation, did not back down. He lowered his head, his lips pulling back from his elongated teeth in a terrifying snarl. He was not just a rival, he was a father, protecting his family. That one human thought, that core piece of his anchor, fueled his animal rage and gave it focus. Uther lunged first, a silver-gray whirlwind of claws and teeth. He was faster and stronger, and he slammed into Arthur, sending both of them tumbling across the floor in a chaotic, snarling heap. They crashed into furniture, splintering a coffee table and sending a floor lamp flying. From the kitchen doorway, Kaelin watched the horrific battle unfold, her hand clamped over Danae's eyes, though the sounds were impossible to block.
The roars, the snarls, the sickening wet sounds of claws finding purchase in flesh, it was the sound of hell itself. Arthur was outmatched. Uther's experience and raw power were too much. The older werewolf pinned him to the floor, its massive jaws snapping inches from Arthur's throat. Arthur struggled, his own claws raking at Uther's thick hide, but he was losing.
Then, Uther's gaze shifted, looking past Arthur toward the kitchen doorway. He saw Kaelin and Denny. He saw easier prey. A new hungry light entered his eyes. He was done playing with the rival. Seeing that shift, knowing what Uther intended, Arthur found a new reserve of strength, born of pure, desperate love. He let out a roar that was entirely his own, a fusion of human desperation and animalistic fury. With a massive, convulsive effort, he twisted his body and sank his teeth into Uther's shoulder. The older werewolf howled in pain and surprise, momentarily distracted. It was the only opening Arthur needed. He kicked out with his powerful legs, throwing Uther off balance, and scrambled to his feet. He didn't press the attack. Instead, he placed himself squarely between the monster and the kitchen doorway. He stood his ground, his body battered and bleeding, a clear, unmistakable barrier. He was panting, his form hunched and broken, but his message was absolute: "You will not pass." Uther, enraged, stared at him. For a moment, a flicker of something other than pure animalistic animalism crossed the older beast's face. Was it recognition? A flicker of the man trapped inside, seeing his own son defending his family? Or was it just the frustration of a predator denied its meal? The moment passed. Uther let out one last furious roar of frustration, then turned and leapt back out the broken window, disappearing into the fog-shrouded morning. The immediate threat was gone. Arthur stood for a moment longer, his chest heaving. Then, the adrenaline that had fueled his savage defense vanished. His body, ravaged by the fight and the transformation, gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, unconscious amidst the wreckage of the living room. Kaelin rushed to his side, her mind reeling. She had just been saved by the very monster she feared her husband was becoming. Chapter 12. A Desperate Gambit. The silence Uther left behind was heavier and more terrifying than the chaos of the fight. The living room was a disaster zone, littered with shattered glass, splintered wood, and dark, viscous spatters of blood, some Uther's, some Arthur's. In the center of it all, Arthur lay still, his breathing shallow and ragged. His face was longer, more angular, and the dark fur was thicker now, matting with the blood from his wounds. He looked less like his husband than ever before. But he had saved them. The beast had saved them. Or had the man, using the beast's strength, saved them? The line was so blurred, she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began.
"Mommy, is Daddy sleeping?" Denny asked, her voice a tiny, frightened whisper from the kitchen doorway. "Yes, sweetie. Daddy's just very tired," Kaelin said, her voice catching. She had to get them out of here. Uther had retreated, but he would be back. And Arthur, when he woke, would he still be the protector, or would the fight have pushed him further into the monster's grip? Her eyes fell on the wreckage of the bay window. Through the shattered opening, shrouded in the morning mist, she could see the shape of Uther's old, dilapidated pickup truck. It was a rust bucket, a relic from another time. But it was also a machine, an engine, a way out. A desperate plan formed in her mind, a long shot fueled by adrenaline and a mother's fierce will to survive. "Denny, I need you to be a very brave girl for me," Kaelin said, standing up and turning to her daughter. "I need you to go back into the kitchen and hide under the table, and I need you to sing your astronaut snail song. Can you do that for me? Sing it loud so I can hear you." Denny nodded, her lower lip trembling, and retreated into the kitchen. A moment later, Kaelin heard the faint, wavering sound of her daughter singing about a snail who dreamed of the stars. It was the sound of her anchor. Kaelin ran to the front door, kicked away the splintered remains of the bookshelf's barricade, and peered outside. The fog was thick, visibility was low, but she couldn't see or hear any sign of Uther. Taking a deep breath, she sprinted from the porch to the truck. The driver's side door was unlocked. It groaned in protest as she pulled it open and slid inside. The cab smelled of oil, old coffee, and something faintly wild, like wet dog. The keys were exactly where Arthur had said Uther always left them, tucked into the worn sun visor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. Click. Nothing. She tried again. Click. The battery was dead. Of course it was dead. No, she whispered, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. No, you have to work. You have to. She popped the hood and stared at the engine, a greasy, complex puzzle she had no idea how to solve. Her own truck, crashed in the ditch, was useless. This was their only chance. Think, Kaelin, think. Her mind raced, sifting through half-remembered articles she'd edited, car maintenance guides she'd glanced at. Jumpstart. You needed another battery to jumpstart a car. She looked at her own truck crashed, just through the trees at the edge of the property. Could she? Was the battery there still good? It was a gamble. It meant leaving the relative safety of the house, leaving Arthur and Denis alone, and venturing back to the scene of the attack. But what choice did she have? Steeling herself, she rummaged in Uther's glove box, her hands finding a grimy flashlight and a set of pliers. Armed with these meager tools, she slipped out of the truck and began making her way toward the ditch, her every sense on high alert. The fog muffled all sound, creating an eerie, claustrophobic silence. Every snapped twig under her feet sounded like a gunshot.
She reached her truck, the front end crumpled against the tree. The electronics were dead, but that didn't mean the battery was. She fumbled with the hood release, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear. It finally popped open. There it was, the battery. She just had to get it out and carry it back. It was heavy, awkward work. She used the pliers to loosen the terminals, sparks flying as she disconnected the cables. She strained, her muscles screaming as she lifted the heavy battery from its housing. She cradled it in her arms like a concrete baby and began the slow, agonizing trek back to Uther's truck. She was halfway there when she heard it. A low growl, seemingly coming from all directions at once in the disorienting fog. Uther. He was out there, hunting. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her breath held tight in her chest. She scanned the wall of white, seeing nothing but ghostly trees. She forced herself to move, faster now, her feet slipping on the damp ground, the heavy battery threatening to pull her down. She reached the old pickup, her lungs burning. With a final surge of strength, she heaved the battery onto the ground, fumbled the hood open, and began the frantic process of trying to connect it. She had no jumper cables. She would have to try to connect the terminals directly. It was stupid, dangerous, and her only hope. Back in the house, Arthur began to stir. He groaned, the sound more animal than human, and pushed himself onto his hands and knees. The man was still buried deep inside, but the beast was now at the surface, wounded, angry, and aware that the den was unprotected. His glowing golden eyes scanned the wrecked room, searching for his mate, for his child. He smelled Colin's scent leading out the front door, mingled with the terrifying rival scent of Uther. A possessive, protective rage began to build in his chest. He staggered to his feet, his transformed body screaming in protest, and limped toward the open door. Outside, Kaelin managed to wedge the second battery next to the first. She took a deep breath and used the pliers to touch the positive terminal from her battery to the positive terminal on Uther's. A shower of brilliant, angry sparks erupted. She cried out, dropping the pliers, her hand tingling from the shock. She scrambled back into the driver's seat, her heart pounding. She turned the key. The engine sputtered. It coughed once, twice, a cloud of black smoke belching from the exhaust. Then, with a deafening roar, it turned over. It caught. It was running. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. She had done it.
She slammed the truck into gear, ready to drive to the front porch, load up her family, and escape. But as she looked up, a figure emerged from the front door of the house. It was Arthur. He was on his feet, his silhouette a horrifying hybrid of man and wolf, his eyes glowing with a feral light in the gray fog. He looked at the running truck, at her, and then he let out a howl.
It was not a howl of pain or of loss. It was a howl of possession, of challenge, and of the untamed wild. He had come not to escape with her, but to claim his territory. Chapter 13. A Kiss Goodbye. The world had narrowed to the space between them. Collins sat in the driver's seat of the rumbling, protesting truck, its engine a ragged heartbeat in the oppressive fog. Arthur stood at the threshold of the house, a creature caught between two worlds. The fight had pushed his transformation, sculpting his features into a more predatory form. The fur was thicker along his spine and shoulders, his posture was a permanent crouch, and the golden eyes burned with an intensity that was no longer entirely human. But as he looked at her, Colin saw the man. It was there, behind the feral glow, in the slight pained tilt of his head. It was in the way his gaze flickered from her to the passenger seat, an unspoken question. Where is Denis? The beast's howl had been one of possession, a claim on his territory and his mate, but the man inside was terrified. He had seen the running truck, and in a flash of human logic, he had understood. She was trying to leave, to run from him. The thought was a shard of ice in the furnace of his new instincts. He took a limping, hesitant step from the porch. He was wounded, his body a roadmap of pain from his battle with Uther, but he moved with a grim purpose. He was not coming to get in the truck. He was coming to stop it. "Arthur, no!" she whispered, her hand hovering over the gear stick. She could leave. She could floor it, spray gravel, and be gone before he could stop her. She could save herself and their daughter. But the thought was a betrayal so profound it made her physically ill. She would not run from him. She was his anchor. She cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. She opened the door and slowly got out, her movements calm and deliberate. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the misty air. "I was getting us a way out, for all of us." He stopped, his head cocked. He didn't understand the words, not all of them, but he understood the tone. He understood she wasn't fleeing. He watched her, his chest rising and falling in deep, ragged breaths. She walked toward him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, that this was a predator, that she was walking into the jaws of a monster. But her heart knew better. This was the man she loved, trapped in a nightmare. "It's okay," she murmured, stopping a few feet from him. "I'm here. I'm not scared." It was a lie. She was terrified, but she would not let him see it. He took the final steps, closing the distance between them. He was taller than she remembered, his new form adding an intimidating height and breadth. He lowered his head, his elongated snout close to her neck, and inhaled deeply, taking in her scent. It was a purely animalistic gesture, a mark of recognition. A low, vibrating rumble started in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but something else, a sound of comfort, of pain. Then he did something that shattered her heart. He reached up with his less injured hand, a hand that was now more of a clawed paw, the nails thick and black, and touched her face. His touch was impossibly gentle. The sharp points of his claws barely grazed her skin. He was trying with every fiber of his being to remember how to be gentle, how to be human. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the full, terrible tragedy of his fight.
The man was there, looking out through the beast's eyes, a prisoner begging for release. He couldn't speak. He couldn't tell her he loved her. He couldn't tell her to run and save herself. So he had to show her. He leaned in, his monstrous face close to hers. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to bite her, to claim her with the beast's mark. Instead, he pressed his lips, thinner now, stretched over his changing jaw, against hers. It was a ghost of a kiss. It was clumsy and strange, the press of an unfamiliar mouth. But the intent behind it, the desperate, soul-crushing emotion, was all Arthur. It was a kiss that screamed everything he could not say. I love you. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Run. A single tear, hot and human, fell from his eye and onto her cheek. It was a tear for the life they had lost, for the man he would never be again. It was a final, heartbreaking goodbye. He pulled back, the man's grief already receding from his eyes, replaced by a grim animal resolve. He turned from her and looked toward the deep fog-shrouded woods. His purpose was clear. He was going to lead the other monster, his father, away from them, and he was going to disappear into the forest to keep his family safe from the thing he was becoming. He took one step, then another, a limping, tragic figure heading for the trees. But before he could be swallowed by the fog, a deafening roar erupted from the woods directly in his path. Uther was back, and he was standing between Arthur and his self-imposed exile. The time for running was over. Chapter 14. Father and Son. Uther emerged from the fog like a demon from a fever dream. He was no longer just a stalking presence. He was a specter of pure rage. The wounds Arthur had inflicted on him earlier had only served to infuriate him, to stoke the feral fire in his soul. His silver fur was matted with his own dark blood, and his massive jaws were parted in a permanent, drooling snarl. He saw Arthur, and he saw Kaelin standing by the truck. The choice for a creature running on pure predatory instinct was simple. Why fight the wounded rival when the easier prey was just a few feet away? With a guttural roar that shook the very air, Uther ignored Arthur completely and charged directly at Kaelin. Time seemed to slow down. Kaelin was frozen, a deer in the path of a freight train. She saw the hatred in Uther's eyes, the saliva flying from his teeth, the massive earth-eating strides that were closing the distance in heartbeats. She was going to die. But Arthur, who had been ready to walk away and sacrifice himself, was not going to let that happen. A sound ripped from his throat that was unlike anything Kaelin had ever heard. It was not a howl of a wolf or a cry of a man.
It was the sound of a soul being shredded, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage at the thought of his mate being harmed. He launched himself forward, a projectile of desperate, protective fury. He didn't try to meet Uther's charge head-on. He was too weak for that. Instead, he slammed into Uther's side, a brilliant, instinctive tackle that used the bigger beast's own momentum against it. The two werewolves went down in a tangled, roaring heap, rolling over and over on the damp, leaf-strewn ground. This was not the brief territorial skirmish from before. This was a death match. Colin, jolted from her paralysis, scrambled backward, her mind screaming. "Denny!" She ran to the house, her heart pounding with a new terror. What if Uther had circled around? What if he'd gotten inside? She burst through the front door. "Denny!" "I'm here, Mommy," came a small voice from the kitchen. Denny was still under the table, her small hands clasped over her ears to block out the horrific sounds from outside. "Stay there! Don't move! Don't look!" Colin commanded, her voice shaking. She couldn't leave Arthur to fight alone, but she couldn't leave her daughter undefended. She was torn, her body vibrating with helpless indecision. Outside, the fight was brutal and ugly. Uther had the weight and the power, and he was using it, his claws tearing deep gouges in Arthur's back and shoulders.
He was trying to get his jaws around Arthur's neck to deliver the final, killing bite. But Arthur had something Uther no longer possessed, an anchor. He was not just an animal fighting for dominance. He was a husband and a father fighting for the lives of his family. Every time Uther's claws tore into him, he didn't just feel pain. He saw Colin's face. He heard Denny's song. His love, twisted and filtered through the beast's rage, became a weapon. Arthur fought with a desperate, savage cunning. He wriggled and twisted, keeping his throat protected. He used his smaller size to his advantage, staying under Uther's primary attacks. He bit and clawed, not at the thick, muscular hide of Uther's back, but at his legs, his belly, anything to cripple the larger beast. Uther, roaring in frustration, finally managed to pin Arthur's shoulders to the ground. He loomed over him, his jaws wide, saliva dripping onto Arthur's face. This was the end, the final, fatal moment. Arthur could see his own terrified reflection in Uther's cold yellow eyes. But in that reflection, he also saw the house behind him. He saw the doorway where his family was cowering. And the man inside him screamed one final defiant command to the beast: protect them. As Uther's jaws descended, Arthur, with a final explosive burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, did the one thing the older wolf didn't expect. He stopped defending. He relaxed his body for a split second, then thrust his own head upward, not away. His elongated teeth, sharp and strong, bypassed Uther's snapping jaws and found their mark in the soft, unprotected flesh of Uther's throat. He bit down, hard. There was a sickening, wet crunch of cartilage and tearing muscle. Uther's roar of triumph turned into a choked, gurgling scream.
Hot blood, thick and coppery, poured from the wound, drenching Arthur's face and chest. The older werewolf convulsed, its massive body thrashing wildly. Its claws raked the air, then its own chest in a mindless agony. Arthur held on, his jaw locked, his eyes squeezed shut, even as the dying beast slammed him against the ground again and again. He held on until the thrashing weakened, until the gurgling faded, until the massive body on top of him went limp and heavy. Slowly, shakily, he released his grip. The dead werewolf slid off him. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his body a canvas of blood and agony. He had won. He had killed the monster. He had saved his family. Chapter 15. The Unveiling. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by Arthur's ragged, painful breathing and the slow drip of blood onto the dead leaves. Kaelin, who had been watching the final horrific moments from the doorway, stepped out onto the porch, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the railing for support. She stared at the scene before her. The body of the massive, silver-furred werewolf lay still, its throat a mangled ruin. And beside it sat her husband, drenched in blood, his form hunched in what looked like exhaustion or grief or both. He had done it. He had faced the demon of his childhood and destroyed it. As she watched, something strange began to happen to the dead creature. A faint, shimmering distortion seemed to pass over its body, like heat rising from asphalt. The thick, powerful limbs seemed to shrink, the snout to recede. The coarse, silver fur appeared to thin, melting back into the skin. The transformation, held in place by the creature's malevolent life force, was failing in death. Arthur saw it too. He crawled closer to the body, a look of dawning, horrified confusion on his face. The form on the ground was now caught in a grotesque state between wolf and man, but it was undeniably more human. The left arm, thrown out at an angle, was now clearly a man's arm, albeit one covered in patches of thinning fur. And on that forearm,
just below the elbow, was a tattoo, faded and distorted by the strange, partial reversion, but still recognizable. It was an eagle with its wings spread, perched atop an anchor. The tattoo of the United States Navy. The same tattoo Arthur had seen on his father's arm 1,000 times as a child when Uther would be working in the yard in a short-sleeved shirt. Kaelin gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The journal, the story, it all converged in this single, horrifying moment of revelation. Arthur stared at the tattoo, his transformed mind struggling to connect the dots. The beast saw a vanquished foe, but the man, the small part of him that was still cowering in the back of his mind, screamed in recognition. Father. The word was not spoken, but it echoed in the space between them, a silent, soul-shattering scream. He hadn't just killed a monster. He hadn't just killed a rival. In a desperate, savage act of love to protect his own family, he had killed his own father, the man whose approval he had sought his entire life, the man whose tragic secret he had only just discovered.
A sound of pure, undiluted agony tore from Arthur's throat. It was a sound that transcended the animal, a cry of such profound human grief and horror that it made the birds in the trees fall silent. He scrambled backward, away from the body, his clawed hand scrabbling at the dirt, trying to get away from the impossible truth. He looked at his own hands, his own arms drenched in his father's blood. He looked at the body, the dead face now a nightmarish fusion of Uther's stern features and a wolf's snout. He had not only inherited his father's curse, he had become his father's executioner. The trauma, the horror, the grief, it was a psychological cataclysm. It was the final devastating blow to the already crumbling wall that held his humanity in check. Colin saw it in his eyes, the flicker of the man she loved, the prisoner looking out from behind the beast's eyes, was extinguished. A new, terrifying light took its place, the vacant pharaoh glow of a mind that had completely and utterly broken. The last thread of his anchor had snapped. Chapter 16. The Final Change. The breaking of Arthur's mind was a visible, physical event. The agony in his eyes vanished, replaced by a blank, terrifying emptiness. The grief that had contorted his features smoothed out, leaving a predatory mask. The patricidal trauma had been a blast furnace, burning away the last stubborn remnants of Arthur Lowell, leaving only the beast. He looked at Colin, but there was no recognition in his gaze. He saw only another creature in his territory. He looked at the house where Denny was hidden, and some primal instinct told him there was something small and vulnerable inside. Prey. A low, guttural growl rumbled at his chest. He took a step toward the house. "Arthur?" Colin breathed, her voice filled with a new kind of terror. This was not the tormented man-beast she had pledged to save. This was something else. This was a monster. "Arthur, it's me." He ignored her. He was focused on the house. He tried to run, but his body, already pushed past its limits, betrayed him. A wave of force, a biological imperative that could no longer be denied, surged through him. He collapsed to the ground with a horrifying, strangled cry. The final transformation had begun. It was a gruesome, agonizing spectacle. Colin could hear the wet, cracking sounds of his bones breaking and resetting, his spine elongated, forcing him into a permanent quadrupedal stance. His shoulders broadened, muscles bunching and twisting under the skin. The fur, which had been patchy, now sprouted thick and fast, a wave of dark, coarse hair that consumed his remaining human skin. His fingers and toes stretched and snapped, reforming into true paws. His human nails tore away, pushed out from their beds by the thick black claws that grew in their place. He screamed, a continuous high-pitched sound of pure physical torment as his body was violently rewritten into a new form. His face pushed forward, the bones of his jaw and skull cracking and reshaping into the long, powerful snout of a true wolf. His ears migrated up the side of his head, becoming pointed and alert.
his vision warped and blurred, the colors bleeding out, replaced by a world of sharp, defined movement and a million shades of gray.
Kaylin could only watch, paralyzed by horror and a grief so profound it felt like it was hollowing out her insides. The man she loved was being unmade before her very eyes, disassembled and rebuilt into a nightmare. In less than a minute, it was over. Where her husband had collapsed, a new creature now stood, shaking its head as if to clear the last vestiges of the agonizing change. It was larger than a timber wolf, leaner and more menacing, with powerful limbs and a coat of dark, almost black fur. It was a perfect killing machine. The only trace of the man it had been was the tormented, intelligent light that had burned in his eyes, and that was now gone, replaced by the cold, yellow, predatory glare of a pure beast. It raised its head and howled. It was not the pained, mournful sound from before. This was the triumphant territorial cry of an apex predator claiming its dominion. Then, its yellow eyes locked onto the house. With a speed that defied its size, it launched itself toward the porch. It didn't bother with the door. It smashed through the wall beside it, splintering wood and plaster, and disappeared inside. Kaylin's grief was instantly incinerated by a hot, primal fear for her daughter. "Denis!" She sprinted for the house, her mind a white noise of terror. She scrambled through the new, jagged hole in the wall. The beast was in the living room, its head low, sniffing the air, tracking the scent of her daughter to the kitchen. "Get away from her!" Kaylin screamed. The werewolf turned, snarling, its lips pulled back to reveal a terrifying arsenal of teeth. It saw her as a threat now, an obstacle. It took a menacing step toward her. Kaylin backed away, her eyes darting around for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the fireplace, the heavy iron poker she had discarded earlier. She grabbed it, its weight a small, cold comfort in her hand. The beast lunged. Kaylin swung the poker with all her might. The iron rod connected with the side of the creature's head with a dull, metallic thud. The werewolf yelped in pain and surprise, stumbling back. It had underestimated her. That was all the time she needed. "Denis, run! Out the back!" she shrieked. She didn't wait to see if Denis obeyed. She turned and ran for the back door herself, the werewolf right behind her, its claws scrabbling on the wooden floor. She burst out into the overgrown backyard, slamming the door behind her. She knew it wouldn't hold for long. She saw Denis scrambling out from under the porch, where a cellar door had been left ajar. Her daughter was terrified, but alive. "Come on," Kaylin yelled, grabbing Denis' hand. They ran. They fled into the misty woods behind the house, with no destination, no plan, only the sound of the back door splintering behind them, and the furious, hunting roar of the beast that had once been her husband. He was no longer trying to protect them. He was now the thing they needed protection from. Chapter 17. A Wife's Vow. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. Kaylin half-dragged, half-carried Denis through the dense, disorienting fog, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. She finally stumbled into a small, rocky overhang, a shallow cave that offered minimal shelter, but was, for the moment, a place to collapse.
Denis was sobbing, her small body trembling with cold and terror. Colin pulled her daughter into her lap, wrapping her arms around her, trying to transfer a warmth she didn't feel. She was running on pure, terrified instinct. Her mind was a maelstrom of grief and horror. Arthur was gone. The man, the soul, the love of her life, erased. In his place was a monster, a creature that was, at this very moment, hunting them. The logical part of her brain, the sharp journalistic mind, told her the truth. Arthur was dead. The thing wearing his body was just a beast to be survived or, if necessary, destroyed. She rocked her daughter, murmuring soothing nonsense, but her own heart was breaking into a million pieces. She had failed. Her love had not been a strong enough anchor. She had lost him. But then, as she held her weeping child, another thought began to surface, a stubborn, defiant ember glowing in the ashes of her despair. She thought of Uther's journal. The beast is stronger than the man. The beast is winning. Uther had fought it for decades. He had lost in the end, but he had fought. What if Arthur wasn't gone? What if he was just buried, trapped deep inside, screaming, unheard? The strongest anchor, the only one that truly holds, is love. Had she truly used it? She had spoken of memories. She had offered comfort.
But had she truly fought, or had she just been a witness to his destruction? A new resolve began to solidify in her heart, forged in the fire of her grief. No, she would not accept this. She would not mourn Arthur Lowell as if he were dead. She would fight for him as if he were a prisoner of war, captured by an enemy that had taken over his very body. She looked down at the silver locket around her neck. It was a simple, heart-shaped piece he had given her for their 5th anniversary. Inside were 2 tiny worn pictures, one of her on their wedding day, the other of a beaming Arthur holding a newborn Denis. It was their life, their love, captured in a small metal container. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol. It was their anchor, made tangible. Her fear did not vanish, but it was transformed. It became fuel. Her grief did not lessen, but it was reshaped. It became her strength. "Mommy," Denis whispered, her sobs subsiding into hiccups. Is he a monster now?" Colin looked into her daughter's terrified eyes and made a vow, to her child and to herself. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice shaking but filled with a powerful, unwavering conviction. "Daddy is sick. He's lost. We have to go find him. We have to help him come home." She had no plan. She had no real weapon. All she had was the knowledge from a dead man's journal, a silver locket, and a love that she now realized was not a passive emotion, but an active, ferocious force. She would not run from the beast anymore. She would go after it. Not to kill it. To save her husband. She waited until Denis's breathing had evened out in a fitful, exhausted sleep. She gently laid her down in the most sheltered part of the overhang, covering her with her own jacket. Then she stood up. She took the iron poker she had somehow managed to hold on to during their flight. It wasn't for fighting.
It was for defense, a last resort. Her real weapon was clutched tightly in her other hand, the locket. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and she stepped out from the shelter. She would not hunt a monster. She would track her husband, and she would bring him home. Chapter 18. Tracking a Monster, Hunting a Husband. The fog was beginning to thin as the sun climbed higher, breaking the uniform gray into shifting, ethereal columns of light and shadow. The forest was no longer a suffocating blanket, but a maze of revealed and hidden things. For Kaylin, it was a hunting ground. She moved with a caution and quiet she didn't know she possessed. Her journalistic skills, honed from years of surveillance and observation, were now being used for the most important story of her life. She was looking for signs, for clues, not just to where the beast had gone, but to who it was. The tracks were easy to find at first. Large canine prints pressed deep into the soft earth, a trail of destruction, snapped branches, trampled ferns. This was the beast, rampaging, driven by its new chaotic instincts. It was moving fast, circling, trying to pick up their scent. She followed the trail for what felt like miles, her body aching, her nerves stretched to their breaking point. Every rustle of leaves, every call of a bird sent a jolt of fear through her. She was tracking a creature that could tear her limb from limb without a second thought. But then she found the first sign. In a small clearing, she saw a rabbit. It was dead, its neck broken with a swift, efficient snap. But it was uneaten. Its body lay pristine on a bed of moss. A predator running on pure instinct, a creature as hungry as the newly transformed Arthur must be, would have devoured it on the spot. But it hadn't. He fought it, she thought, her heart giving a hopeful leap. The instinct was to kill, but the man, somewhere deep inside, refused to let it eat. It was a small thing, a dead rabbit in the woods, but to Kaylin it was a flare of light in the overwhelming darkness. Arthur was still in there. He was fighting. She pushed on, her resolve hardened. The tracks became less frantic, more purposeful. He was no longer rampaging. He was moving, heading somewhere. She followed, her hope warring with her fear. The next sign was even more powerful.
The tracks led to a steep, narrow ravine, a place where the earth had fallen away, creating a short but treacherous drop. The beast's tracks went right to the edge, then abruptly turned, following the ravine for 100 yards to a place where it was safer and easier to cross. Kaylin stopped, her breath catching in her throat. A true animal, especially one in pursuit, would have leapt the ravine without a thought. But Arthur knew this terrain. He knew that a person, a running woman, a small child could easily slip and fall here. He had avoided it, not for himself, for them. He was tracking them, yes, but he was also, in some deeply buried subconscious way, protecting them from the landscape itself. The beast was hunting them, but the man was clearing a safe path.
The terrible, beautiful paradox of it brought tears to her eyes. He was both the monster they were fleeing and the guardian angel they didn't know they had. The conflict inside him must be monumental, a war for his own soul being waged with every step he took. She was no longer afraid of finding him. She was now terrified of what it would cost him to keep fighting and what would happen if he finally lost. The tracks eventually led her out of the deep woods and toward the edge of a large, cleared field. In the center of the field stood a massive, dilapidated barn, its red paint faded to a dull, peeling pink, its roof sagging in the middle like the spine of an old horse. The tracks led directly to the large, semi-open barn door. He was in there, waiting. She clutched the silver locket in her hand until her knuckles were white. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and gold. Night was coming, and she knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the beast would be stronger in the dark. She couldn't leave him in there. She couldn't let the night reclaim him completely. The final confrontation had to be now. She took a deep breath and started walking across the open field toward the dark, yawning mouth of the barn. Chapter 19. The Trap. The interior of the barn was a cathedral of shadows and silence. Dust motes danced like fairies in the few golden shafts of light that pierced the decaying roof. The air was thick with the smells of old hay, rotting wood, and the sharp animal musk of the creature she was hunting, her husband. Colin stepped inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The iron poker felt cold and heavy in her hand. The massive space was a labyrinth of forgotten farm equipment, towering stacks of hay bales and empty animal stalls. It was a perfect place for an ambush. "Arthur?" she called out, her voice sounding small and fragile in the cavernous space. "I know you're in here. I'm not here to hurt you." The only reply was the frantic cooing of a pigeon, startled from its roost in the rafters. She moved deeper into the barn, placing her feet carefully to avoid snapping a stray piece of wood or kicking a loose stone. She was the bait. She knew it. She was drawing him out, hoping that her presence, her voice would be enough to reach the man inside before the beast could react. A floorboard creaked in the hayloft above her. She froze. Her head snapped up. She saw nothing but deeper shadows, but she had heard it. He was up there, stalking her, watching her. "Arthur, please," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "Don't do this. Come back. Denny needs you. I need you." A low growl answered her from the darkness above. It was not a sound of recognition. It was the sound of a predator losing patience with its prey. She had to do something to stop him, to slow him down without escalating the violence. Her eyes scanned the cluttered floor. Her gaze landed on a length of thick rope coiled near an old winch system, and next to it, a large, rusty foothold trap, the kind used for catching foxes or coyotes. It was a cruel, barbaric-looking thing.
Her mind recoiled at the thought of using it on him. But what other choice did she have? It wasn't about hurting him. It was about immobilizing him. It was about getting a single moment, a single chance to break through.
Working with a desperate, silent speed, she dragged the trap into the center of the barn, directly under the hayloft. She used the poker to pry the powerful jaws open, her heart pounding as she struggled with the mechanism. With a loud snap, the jaws locked into the set position. She carefully placed it on the floor and, using the rope, rigged a crude tripwire, hiding it under a thin layer of loose straw. It was a clumsy, desperate plan, but it was the only one she had. "I'm not leaving without you," she shouted up at the hayloft, her voice echoing in the rafters. The response was immediate. A dark, massive shape launched itself from the edge of the loft, a terrifying silhouette against the dying light. It landed on the ground with a heavy, solid thud, its yellow eyes blazing with feral intensity. It was no longer waiting. The hunt was on. It lowered its head and charged. Kaylin stumbled backward, her feigned bravery evaporating into pure terror. It was moving too fast. It was going to miss the trap entirely. But in its blind, predatory rage, it didn't see the thin rope stretched across its path. Its front leg caught the tripwire. With a loud metallic clang, the jaws of the trap snapped shut. The werewolf let out a piercing, agonized shriek and collapsed, its front leg caught firmly in the rusted steel teeth. It thrashed on the ground, a whirlwind of black fur and snarling fury, biting at the trap, trying to wrench its leg free. Kaylin watched, her heart breaking at the sight of his pain. "Arthur, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she cried. The beast's frenzied thrashing stopped. It grew still, its head low to the ground, its breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. The intense physical shock of the pain seemed to have done something unexpected. It had pierced the red haze of the beast's rage. Slowly, it lifted its head, and its eyes, when they met hers, were different. The blank, feral glow was gone. In its place, for the first time since the final transformation, was a flicker of something else. Confusion, recognition, and a deep, soul-crushing agony. The man was looking at her. He was trapped, both in the steel jaws of the trap and in the monstrous prison of his own body. He let out a low, mournful whine, a sound of such profound suffering that it brought Kaylin to her knees. The pain, she realized, had not just trapped his leg. It had given him a moment of clarity. It had reconnected him to his human self, if only for a second. But she knew that second wouldn't last. The beast, driven by pain and instinct, would resurface with a vengeance. And she knew what a cornered, wounded animal would do. She had to get out of there. She had to lead him somewhere else, somewhere significant. She scrambled to her feet and ran from the barn, not looking back. She ran towards the woods, towards the one place this whole nightmare had begun, the old hunting blind. Chapter 20. The Last Stand. The sun was a bleeding wound on the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the land. Kaylin ran, her breath tearing at her lungs, her legs burning with an exhaustion that went bone deep.
She didn't need to look back to know he was coming. She could hear him. The beast, in its agony and rage, had broken the chain holding the trap and was now dragging the heavy steel device with it. The rhythmic clang-scrape of the trap on the rocky ground was a terrifying, inexorable metronome counting down the final moments of her life. The sound was punctuated by roars of pure, unadulterated fury. The flicker of humanity she had seen in the barn was gone, drowned in a sea of pain. She finally saw it through the trees, the massive oak, its branches like skeletal arms reaching for the bruised twilight sky, and nestled high within them, the dark, boxy shape of the hunting blind, Uther's blind, the place where a 10-year-old boy's innocence had been shattered.
She had left Danae hidden in the woods a safe distance away, with strict instructions not to move, no matter what she heard. This final act was for her alone. She scrambled up the old rickety ladder, the wood groaning under her weight. She tumbled onto the small platform and pulled the trapdoor shut, plunging herself into the dusty, cramped darkness. It smelled of mildew, gun oil, and 30 years of fear. Propped in the corner, just as she had prayed it would be, was Uther's old rifle. She had seen it when she and Arthur had first arrived. It was his spare, the one he always left here. She picked it up. It was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands. She checked it with fumbling fingers. It was loaded. The clang scrape was closer now, right at the base of the tree. A furious guttural snarl echoed from below, followed by the sound of claws digging into bark. He was climbing. Kaylin's hands trembled, her whole body shaking. This was it, the final, unthinkable choice. Uther's journal had said love was the anchor, but it had also chronicled his own slow, inevitable defeat. What if love wasn't enough? What if the only mercy she could offer the man she loved was a quick, clean death, to free him from the monster that had stolen his body and shattered his mind? She raised the rifle, peering through the narrow shooting slit in the wooden wall. She could see him, a hulking black shape, pulling himself up the tree with a terrifying three-limbed strength, the heavy trap on his front leg clanging against the trunk with every movement. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. This was Arthur, her Arthur, the man who made her laugh, the man who held her when she cried, the father of her child, and she was pointing a rifle at his heart. He reached the platform. A heavy, solid thump as he landed outside. Then silence. A dreadful, waiting silence. She could hear his ragged, pained breathing just on the other side of the thin wooden door. She pointed the rifle at the door, her finger resting on the trigger. Her mind was screaming, "This is wrong. There has to be another way." But her survival instinct, her primal need to protect her child, was a powerful, cold voice in her head. He is a monster. He killed his father. He will kill you. He will kill Danae. Do it. A clawed hand, impossibly large, appeared over the top of the door, its black talons digging into the wood. He was pulling himself up.
His head and shoulders appeared, a terrifying silhouette against the last dying light of the day, his yellow eyes burning with a cold, merciless fire, locked on to hers. The man was gone. There was nothing left but the beast. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Chapter 21. A Daughter's Plea. The moment stretched into a terrifying eternity. Kaylin's world had shrunk to the space between her and the monster that was her husband. The cold steel of the rifle was pressed against her shoulder, the sight aligned with the center of his chest. All she had to do was squeeze. One final convulsive movement of a single finger, and it would all be over. The nightmare would end. The man she loved would be free. Her daughter would be safe. Her mind screamed at her to do it, to pull the trigger before he could break through the flimsy door. He was a monster. There was no Arthur left. The beast that had been Arthur let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound of imminent violence. It placed its other paw on the door and pushed. The wood groaned, splintering around the hinges. It was going to break. This was the last second, the last chance. From the edge of the woods, a small voice, thin but clear, cut through the twilight. "Daddy!" It was Danae. She hadn't stayed hidden. She had followed, drawn by the terrible sounds, and now she stood at the base of the great oak tree, a tiny figure looking up at the horrifying tableau. The beast froze. Its head, which had been pushing against the door, snapped in the direction of the sound. Its yellow eyes, which had been filled with nothing but murder, widened slightly. "Daddy, I know you're in there!" Danae's voice was stronger now, laced with the pure, unwavering faith of a child.
It was a voice that knew nothing of curses or monsters, only of her father. "Don't leave us! Please, Daddy! I miss you!" Her words were not a weapon. They were not a spell. They were just the truth. And they struck the beast with more force than any bullet could have. A tremor ran through its massive frame. A sound escaped its throat, a choked, whining sound, as if two opposing forces were tearing it apart from the inside. The feral rage in its eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of utter, agonizing confusion. It looked down at Danae, then back at Kaelin, who still had the rifle aimed at its heart. The beast didn't understand the words, but the man, the prisoner buried deep, deep inside, did. He had heard his daughter's voice. He had heard his name, Daddy. The single word was a key, unlocking a door that had been slammed shut and barricaded. A tiny sliver of the man, of Arthur Lowell, seeped through the cracks. The beast was still in control, but for the first time it was no longer alone in its own head. It was confused. It was conflicted. Kaelin saw it. She saw the change in its eyes, the subtle shift in its posture from pure aggression to bewildered torment. Danae's plea had not saved him, but it had bought them a single, precious moment. It had cracked the monster's armor, and now it was her turn to break it open. Chapter 22. The Silver Locket. Seeing that flicker of her husband in the monster's eyes, Kaelin knew what she had to do. The cold voice of survival in her head was silenced, overwhelmed by the roar of her love. She would not kill him.
She would not abandon him. She would drag him back from the abyss if it was the last thing she ever did. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the rifle. She let it clatter to the wooden floor of the blind. The sound was a declaration. The time for violence was over. The creature on the other side of the door watched her, its head tilted, the confusion in its eyes deepening. It had expected a shot, an attack. The absence of it was more disorienting than any blow. Cowan reached up and fumbled with the clasp at the back of her neck. She pulled the silver locket free. It felt warm in her palm, a small, solid weight of love and memory. She held it out, her hand trembling, the silver heart glinting in the last rays of the setting sun. It swung gently on its chain, a pendulum marking the seconds between damnation and salvation. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft but carrying an unshakable strength. The beast flinched at the name, a low whine escaping its throat. "I know you're in there," she continued, her eyes locked with his. "I know you're fighting. Denny is here. I am here. We are your home. You have to come home now." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the splintering door, her hand outstretched, the locket held before her like a shield. "This is not you," she said, her voice breaking, but her resolve holding firm. "You are not a monster. You are my husband. You are a writer who loves old books. You are a man who cries at sad movies. You are the father who taught our daughter how to ride her bike, who stayed up all night building her a dollhouse for Christmas. That is who you are." The beast recoiled, as if she were striking it, but it made no move to attack. It was mesmerized by the swinging locket, by the sound of her voice, by the memories her words were clawing up from the depths of its consciousness. The man inside was screaming, fighting, using her words as a ladder to climb out of the pit. "Come back to me," she pleaded, her voice now a raw, desperate whisper. She was standing at the threshold of the door, inches from him. "Fight it, Arthur. Fight it. I love you." She pressed the locket into his hand, the one that wasn't trapped. She closed his large, clawed fingers around the small silver heart. The moment the cold metal touched his skin, the beast roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was not a roar of rage, but of exorcism. It thrashed its head from side to side, as if trying to shake her voice, her memories, the very essence of its human self out of its mind. But it was too late.
The anchor had found its mooring. The lighthouse had cut through the storm. The love which it had fought and suppressed and tried to kill was now flooding its senses, and it was burning the beast away from the inside out. Chapter 23. The Dawn of Hope. The werewolf's roar faded into a long, agonizing howl as it collapsed onto the platform of the hunting blind. It convulsed, its massive body racked with spasms, the silver locket still clutched in its paw. The final battle was not being fought with claws and teeth, but deep within the creature's soul.
Kaylin stumbled back, giving him space, her heart in her throat as she watched the horrifying, miraculous reversal. It was the transformation from the night before, but playing backward, and it was just as violent. The sound of cracking, shrinking bones filled the air. The thick, black fur receded in waves, revealing pale, sweat-drenched human skin beneath. The elongated snout shortened, the ears rounded, the paws reshaped themselves into hands and feet, the black claws retracting to reveal torn, bleeding nail beds. It was a grueling, torturous process. Arthur's screams were muffled, caught between the changing shape of his jaw and teeth, emerging as choked, inhuman sounds of pure agony. Finally, the convulsions subsided. Lying on the floor of the hunting blind, curled in a fetal position, was not a monster, but a man. He was naked, covered in blood, bruises, and sweat, his body scarred and forever altered. The trap was still clamped cruelly around his ankle, a stark reminder of the nightmare they had just endured. But it was him. It was Arthur. He lay still for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow, shuddering gasps. Then, slowly, he opened his eyes. They were no longer glowing yellow. They were the warm, familiar brown she knew so well, and they were filled with a universe of pain, confusion, and dawning memory. He looked at his hands, then at his own battered body. He saw the rifle on the floor, and then he looked at Kaylin. His expression crumpled. Tears streamed from his eyes, silent and unending. He remembered. He remembered it all. The fight, his father, hunting his own family. Kaylin, he rasped, his voice raw and broken, the first word he had spoken in what felt like a lifetime. She rushed to his side, falling to her knees and gathering him into her arms. He flinched at her touch, a whimper of self-loathing escaping his lips, but she held him tighter. "I'm here," she whispered, her own tears soaking his hair. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got you." He wept in her arms, great shoulder-shaking sobs of a man who had been to hell and back. He was broken, scarred, and forever changed. But he was alive, and he was human. He was home. The curse was not broken. Kaylin knew that from the journal. It was a part of his blood now, a predator that would always live inside him, waiting for the next full moon, for a moment of rage or weakness. But now, they knew how to fight it. They had the anchor. They had each other. As the first true rays of dawn pierced the morning sky, painting the world in soft shades of pink and gold, Kaylin helped him to his feet. She found the release for the trap, freeing his swollen, bruised ankle. Leaning heavily on her, he limped to the edge of the blind. Together, they looked out at the valley below, the same beautiful valley he had once described seeing as a child. It was not an end. It was a new, terrifying, and uncertain beginning. Chapter 24. A New Beginning. They didn't speak on the slow, painful walk back to the house. There were no words for what they had endured.
Arthur leaned on Kalan, every step an effort, his body a testament to the brutal war he had survived. Denis, who had been waiting anxiously, ran to them. She didn't remark on his nakedness or the blood. She just wrapped her small arms around his leg and held on tight. The house was a wreck, a monument to their nightmare. The body of Uther, reverted fully to his human form in death, still lay in the yard. They would have to deal with that. They would have to deal with everything. They knew they could never go back to San Francisco. They could never explain what had happened. Their old life was as dead as the man lying in the yard. Their future was here, in this isolated house, on this cursed land. Later that day, after they had cleaned up as best they could, Kalon sat with Arthur on the porch steps. She had dressed his wounds, and he was wrapped in a thick blanket. Denis was asleep inside, finally succumbing to an exhaustion that had gone beyond fear. The silence between them was no longer one of pain, but of quiet understanding. Arthur finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a love that was deeper and more profound than anything she had ever seen. "You saved me," he said, his voice still a raw whisper. "I was gone, and you pulled me back." "We saved each other," she replied, taking his hand. "You never stopped fighting. Even when the beast was in control, you were still in there, protecting us." He shook his head, a fresh wave of grief washing over him. "My father," she said softly. "He was a prisoner, Arthur, for 30 years. A prisoner who did everything he could to keep his son from the same fate. In the end, you didn't kill your father. You freed him." He looked at her, at the unwavering strength and love in her eyes. He knew their life would now be a constant battle, a calendar marked by the phases of the moon. He would have to live with the wolf inside him forever, but as he held her hand, as he felt the warmth of her skin against his, he knew he would not face it alone. Their love, tested by monstrous change and forged in the crucible of horror, had become something stronger than any curse. It was their anchor. It was their salvation. It was everything.
He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. He was home. They say true love is a soul's recognition of its counterpoint in another, Kaelin thought, holding him tightly. The last rays of the sun warming their faces. Mine recognized you, not just in the man, but in the monster, and I will not let you go. Wow, what an emotional roller coaster. Arthur and Kaelin have been through so much, but their love proved stronger than any curse. But the fight isn't over. It's only just beginning. What did you guys think? What was the most heartbreaking moment for you in this entire story? Was it the final fight between father and son? Or was it when Kaelin had to make that impossible choice in the hunting blind? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this paranormal romance story and want to see what happens next in Arthur and Kaelin's journey, make sure you hit that like button, share this story with a friend who loves a good werewolf story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of our future tales. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.